All right, welcome everybody. We are happy to have you here today on this webinar as we talk about the roles and relationships between residents and faculty, choosing the appropriate hat to wear. I'm Rylan Hellstern from Summit Pacific Medical Center, and I'm joined by my colleagues here, Dr. Keith Dickerson, Dr. Randall Reitz, and Teresa Giandonato from St. Mary's Family Medicine Residency in Grand Junction, Colorado. So, before we start, we just wanted to give a general outline of what we hope to do today. We're going to first, in order to kind of set the stage for what we're discussing, provide a case discussion and some guidelines, ethical guidelines about these roles and relationships. Then we're going to talk about three different research projects that we engaged in and the findings there. And then at the end, we'll talk about best practices for the what next, what to do with the information that we provided. So to start off, we wanted to provide a case that can give us an example of what this can look like in a residency setting. So we love alliteration. So for this example here, Fernanda is going to be our faculty member and Rebecca is going to be our resident. We'll start with when Rebecca is a PGY1. Rebecca does very well in residency, but does struggle raising her child as a single parent. During Rebecca's PGY1 year, Fernanda and Rebecca regularly socialize with each other outside of clinic by scheduling playdates for their children. Fernanda and Rebecca live in the same neighborhood and both have dogs. Whenever one of them travels, the other stops by their house to walk and feed the dogs. They are Facebook friends and have posted on each other's wall. So, having kind of presented this case, I want to turn it over to our panel or our other members here to talk about this a little bit. Why do you feel like the individuals, both the faculty and the resident, acted the way that they did? Do you feel like this is typical or atypical from your experience and residencies in general?
Yeah, I'll go first. So they are all both humans who enjoy interaction with other humans, and so this feels very natural to me. They are kind of enjoying the social aspects of being neighbors and being in the residency together. Um, I do have some concern that they are putting quite a bit of priority on their social relationship, and I don't see major concerns right now. This seems somewhat common among residencies that I'm familiar with, but I'm just kind of looking ahead a little bit to see how this plays out in the future.
And I would say from my almost 22 years as faculty, this is pretty representative of when faculty and residents are in similar stations in life. For instance, have kids, they might have the same preschool or elementary school activities and will be interacting, which is perfectly natural.
And coming from a recent grad, I think that looking at this case, I think it's really natural to be when you're starting a program to want that social connection, and it can come particularly good. It can feel really good coming from faculty members that you relate to. It can increase your sense of like belonging in the program when you're starting out.
Great. Thank you for providing those perspectives. And it sounds like, especially beginning residency and from what you all have seen, this seems pretty common and familiar. So we want to move to now progressing to Rebecca's second and third year as a resident and provide a little bit more context there. So as Rebecca begins her PGY2 year, she continues to excel throughout the year. Later in the year, Fernanda sees Rebecca's son as a patient and removes a wart off of his finger. They also carpool 200 miles to attend a conference and engage in personal conversation. Rebecca describes difficulties with her ex-husband and from being a single parent. Fernanda, in turn, shares that she has had frequent run-ins with the residency program director, and Rebecca shares her similar frustrations. So moving to PGY3, as a PGY3, Rebecca increases her visits to Fernanda's office with increased exhaustion, sleep disruption, and self-doubt. Fernanda prescribes her sertraline, and Rebecca requests that Fernanda not disclose her issues to other faculty, worrying that this might impact future employment. Fernanda honors this request initially, but then becomes more concerned when other faculty members report that Rebecca's patient care and other duties have been sagging, and the others chalk it up to senioritis. So I'll turn it back over to our panelists here to ask a similar question. Do you find that this is typical or atypical? And what has changed here? Have things progressed to over these next 2 years?
Yeah, thanks, Rylan. I would say looking at the PGY2 example first gets to several issues I've seen over the years. One being providing hallway medicine or informal care, either to residents or family members, which can always be a bit fraught if it's not making it into the medical record by the usual means. And then the going to a conference is not uncommon. Often we're trying to save costs by traveling together. But where it really gets concerning then is more or less talking about the program director in a way that is probably not quite professional between faculty and residents.
I would add that in the PGY1 year, they had kind of three different roles in each other's lives. The primary role was, faculty and resident, but there was also the social role, and then somewhat of a service provision role of watching each other's dogs and things like that. And in the years 2 and 3, they really extended the social role to be like personal confidant, and they add this whole new healthcare provider role. Um, and eventually became almost like a primary care physician of prescribing medications and taking care of the warts on the son's finger. And so Fernanda has really kind of said, I'm going to be in multiple roles in this resident's life at the same time. And she later finds out that puts her in a tough spot where she has inside information that other people don't. And she's has to decide, do I share this with other people or do I keep it to myself?
To go off of kind of what Randall is saying, those lines, it seems that as the years progress, those lines of roles kind of start to blur. And I think that's something that's important to keep in mind is that there's still a power dynamic there, and that power dynamic doesn't go away despite how they're interacting socially. And it seems like Fernanda puts a lot of just is putting a lot of weight on Rebecca to keep these secrets, to, it's just putting on some responsibility of Rebecca because their social lines are blurring.
And then clearly by PGY3, we're seeing more concern where there is conflict between the informal and formal roles. As issues develop, now there's been a request not to share with the rest of the faculty what might be good information or helpful information to help all the faculty understand and support the resident as best as possible.
I think, in essence, because of that role confusion, Fernanda, the faculty, has compromised her faculty role in some ways, and in some ways, the other roles, social, healthcare provider, have taken more precedence over the faculty role.
Thank you all for your thoughts and your points of view, and I'm sure we could dive into this even more. And this is just one case, and we just hope to point out the complexity that can come with these relationships and these roles. And so it could be easy to think, we need some guidelines, we need some structure. And that's kind of what we thought when we had discussed this in our various research projects. And so we went to look at what are the guidelines that are available, what research has already been done that can provide us with some of that guidance. So I'll turn it to Keith and Teresa to talk a little bit about what has already been made available.
So with behavioral health, there's a lot of discussion about dual relationships. I just graduated with my master's of social work last year, and it was day one we were talking about dual relationships. Our professors were they were basically telling us not to be friends with anybody because they were very aware of how relationships can change over time. In orientation, it was very clear that our professors were not going to be our best buds. And they even went as far as to say, don't be friends with your classmates because they might be your supervisor someday. which seems to be more on the extreme end. But there was a very large discussion. It's in our rules as social workers not to have dual relationships with people.
And my perspective is training in the 90s, so some has probably changed, but certainly I did not get any training in this as a medical student or resident. And it's only once I became faculty that we even at our program began talking about these sorts of issues of boundaries. And in doing a literature review, there's very little in the medical professional associations about this. The AMA does have a code of medical ethics, but does not at all comment on the roles between teachers and learners. And there is one other AMA opinion, 1.2.1, that talks about treating self or family. And that's the only guidance I could find where maybe it could be sharpened up or modified to include defining proper boundaries between learners and their faculty. But it does seem that universally across both medical and behavioral disciplines, of course, sexual relationships and sexual harassment are not allowed. That's the one consistent thread. And doing a little deeper dive into what is in the literature about this topic, it's quite scant. I could only find really this one article that looked by Recupero researching supervisor-trainee relationship boundaries, and it looked at from the resident perspective, interviewing residents about their experience. And this paper did show residents notice significant boundary crossing behaviors, including problems with academic and professional boundaries, personal boundaries, and even dating boundaries. There's even less research in the medical student realm. I could only find really one major article on that. And Randall, I'm going to turn it over to you now to address this one other little aspect.
Yeah. So ACGME recently, in the world of burnout and other problems that residents are facing these days, said programs in partnership with their sponsoring institutions have the same responsibility to address well-being as other aspects of resident competence. And the word "same responsibility," I think, in some ways, can be seen as putting wellness assurance on the same level as competence. And so it puts the faculty in somewhat of a healthcare provision role of saying, my job is to make sure that you are well in our residency, not just competent. And so I think it does, again, blur what is the faculty's role with residents.
So, having looked at what is already available, what research is out there, and what guidelines, it's clear that there is a lot of gray. So we wanted to see what that looked like for not just our own experience, but for other residencies in the nation. And so I'm going to turn it over to Randall to talk about the first research study that was conducted, and then we'll talk about the other two afterwards. Randall?
Rylan? Yeah, so going back about 10 years, we did a research project with our faculty and a couple of residents, just trying to find out what is common as it relates to roles between faculty and residents across the country. And so we did a grounded theory study. Grounded theory is where you identify a population with a shared concern, and then you go straight to the people themselves and ask them how they try to address the concern. And so for our study, the concern was just the nature of roles and relationships between faculty and residents. And so we did 22 interviews with faculty across the country. About half were physician faculty, half were behavioral health faculty. And we did an analysis of the themes of what they told us in answer to our questions. And then the outcome was we created a visual model that attempts to show the nature of these roles and relationships and how to create a balance within them. And so this is our first model, kind of a classic looking scale with a fulcrum where we have on the left-hand side the core roles of faculty, which are role model, advisor, teacher, supervisor, and evaluator. And on the right-hand side, were these non-core roles, they aren't really part of the curriculum, but are also very common. And we tried to figure out what is kind of the center point of this, kind of the sweet spot for how you do this role. And so for a social role, we thought that'd be friendly colleague. You should be a friendly person to be around, collegial interaction. For the healthcare role, we call that the wellness supporter. You're aware of the residents' wellness. You are attentive to their needs. You might provide a referral for them if you're aware of something. And then for more of a transactional or contractual role, we call it helping hand. And so that's like helping them find out what's available in the community for getting your hair done, helping them maybe move into their house when they move into the community, giving their recommendations. And then on the right hand side, we also have these little hooks with disengaged and enmeshed. And the idea there was that if you are overly disengaged in this role, as in friendly colleague, you're not even engaging with them in a friendly way, you're only purely professional, only sticking to your medical duties, you will be disengaged, and that would attach this weight of disengagement to that side of the scale, and then would make that side of the scale weigh heavily more prominent than the core roles. And then in mesh is the opposite. It's where you're going too far into that role, like with Fernanda and Rebecca when they became personal confidants. They became enmeshed in that way. And same thing with wellness supporter. If I'm completely oblivious and not caring about the residents' wellness needs, that'd be disengaged. And mesh would be providing primary care to someone. And then helping hand, in mesh there might look like doing contractual things like renting an apartment or having a moonlighting service that the residents are employed by. And so just briefly, 73% of our participants mentioned that there should be some sort of a social role, and they kind of defined it as friendly colleague. And then wellness supporter, 68% said that there should be some role for making sure that residents are well. And then 32% talked about a transactional role and how that could look. And again, helping hand is kind of where we settle on that one.
So for our second phase of research we conducted last year, where we were then wanting to know what the opinions of the residents were in their roles with their faculty members. So we did another thematic analysis where we interviewed different residents from all over the country. So this is just our quick demographics, our sample size. We actually had 13 responses of all the emails that we sent out. Only 12 people we got to interview. Turns out residents have very busy schedules and they're hard to contact. So this is just if you're interested in kind of the demographic of our sample size, various population densities that came in. Yeah. So first, what was important is that we asked residents to describe unprompted what roles were important to them in their faculty members. And these were just some of our most commonly described unofficial roles and our official roles. So 83.3% mentioned mentor, 66.7% mentioned social role. There was 25% mentioned an informal consultant of some sort, and transactional role was 8.3%. And then the official roles were under mentor, supervisor had a high ranking as well, teacher, advisor, and evaluator, kind of going off of those same terms that Randall mentioned in the phase 1 of research. And again, these were unprompted. So these are terms that came up in our interviews by the residents on their own. So a really, really big part of our research that I think was a main point that came from it is that residents seem to value that social connection with their faculty members, which I think can be both a really big, it's important for faculty members to know that, but it also can create like some difficulty knowing where that social boundary is. This is just a quote I pulled from our research, just identifying how important this role is. One resident said, "I have these faculty members where I wonder, are they having a tough day or time? And really, I'm in a position with those faculty members where I have no idea what's going on with them personally, or like how they feel about things, because they're just functioning in this professional only way. And those are also the people I don't reach out to for help." So just kind of identifying that residents don't feel comfortable going to faculty members that they don't feel like they have a social connection with, or they don't understand what's going on in their personal life. So there is importance in sharing your personal life as a faculty member with residents, and finding that boundary can be really hard. So our model feedback, there's just three main things that we wanted to change after interviewing residents. There's a lot of confusion around some of the terminology that we used in our initial model, enmeshed being one of them. A lot of residents didn't understand the context of which it was being used. The primary roles, a lot of residents felt like hold more importance in a faculty's job than the secondary roles, although the secondary roles were still identified as valuable. And then there was a lot of misinterpretation of the secondary role labels, the ones that Randall explained earlier. So when we look at our new model, we had a couple changes that I'm going to point out. First, there was we changed enmeshed to overly engaged, to kind of make it a little bit more clear. Then we changed the fulcrum. You can see that this indicates that the primary roles have more weight than the secondary roles. Then we changed the role model role in those primary roles or curricular roles, as it's labeled here, to mentor, because mentor was just a term that was used more than role model. Then we switched around those secondary roles and we tried to give them labels that would create a better understanding. So we changed it to social role, healthcare role, and then transactional role. Then we switched we switched primary role to curricular role to indicate that there's just to clarify the understanding. And then also we switched secondary role to non-curricular roles, indicating that the academics of those two roles, one is more academic and one is not. And then lastly, we just changed the label of the whole weighted system to residency faculty to cast a broader net of who this model is for.
And as Teresa mentioned, this was further research into the resident aspect. And as I found from my literature review, it was similarly a resident-based analysis. And so we then decided to try to expand the research base by sending out a survey to family medicine faculty. So to get the faculty perspective to complement the resident perspective. We ended up getting responses from 213 U.S. family medicine faculty, medical, behavioral, and pharmacist. And we did a mixed methods analysis with both quantitative and qualitative data, and basically had 8 questions specifically to ask about various types of relationships, both the curricular and non-curricular. 1 question about whether their program actually had a policy of any sort on these sort of role relationships. And then finally, a open-ended question where the faculty could provide a vignette to exemplify whatever they had observed in their career involving relationships and boundaries. And we ended up then parsing the data in a couple different ways. We did get a fairly balanced response from male and female faculty, from urban and non-urban. But then the 3 researchers looked at all the data and tried to come up with categories. The one main category that jumped out was social relationships, and 68% did mention that faculty had commingled to however they defined that in an informal way. 36% had some degree of a personal relationship, similar to the PGY1 example we had given earlier, and 24% followed on social media. The next category that we parsed it into is these other more clinical relationships. 54% reported doing minor services in the clinic, either medical or behavioral, and 14 more intensive, similar to what ended up happening in our earlier vignette, where prescription of medicine or something else that would be much more beyond something superficial. And then lastly, we parse the data into the transactional relationships, and very few faculty of the 200 or so that we got responses from had any of these. Only 3% had engaged in paid services, only 2% in some sort of professional moonlighting type services, and only a 0.5% had been in a formal rental type situation.
With kind of the examples of more of an egregious example from the open-ended discussion. This is from one quote that we thought was particularly compelling and revealing. So one person said, in referring to a colleague, like all boundary crossing problems, it's not just one instance for this physician. It's the global lax boundaries with things like medical favors, providing and managing Ozempic, STI treatment, etc. We're in a major metropolitan area. There's no lack of access. Favoritism for residents that they hang out with socially, disrupting the feedback procedures by talking outside with residents and running interference for them before they talk to the PD. Advocating for exceptions for standard leave of absence and pay and not reporting it for preferred residents, and creating a culture of in-groups versus out-groups. It's not the big stuff like financial dual relationships, but the slimy, can't quite get your hands on the stuff that makes us fellow faculty members uncomfortable. I think this really shows, so some of the examples of what could be more problematic and really how it impacts the other faculty, that they are feeling like they are left out of the loop. It puts the PD in a tough spot, and it feels like they are unable to maintain the roles they would like to have with their residents because of this one person having these extreme relationships with residents.
Thank you. So that is just a broad overview of the 3 separate research projects that were conducted, and gives some context as to what we found. And I think, we've presented this in a couple different formats, and a lot of the question at the end is, so what? What do we do with this information? If anything, we've just pointed out how complicated it is. We've tried to provide a model to illustrate and shape the dual relationships that are there, but how do we manage these multiple roles? And so we're not going to give a specific answer, but we do have an example from another residency of what was provided.
So when we first did this research 10 years ago, this is the original model. Our hope was that this would be a nice tool for provoking conversations and maybe guiding what residencies do to shape these relationships. And so what we did in our program is we created this little 2-page document that kind of defines the roles and what's commonly done and what could be done in our residency. And then we actually surveyed our faculty about, do you think this particular example is something that would be generally appropriate, or could be done on a case-by-case basis, or typically avoid, or always avoid. And so with personal relationships, we give an example of playing on a sports team together. And 100% of our faculty said, that sounds fine to me. Leading a resident support group, very common for behavioral faculty to do that in a residency. In our program, 93% said that's great. Accept a friend's social media request, a resident's social media request, 85% said, sure, that's fine. And then it got less and less common. And, at the far end, always avoid was less than 10% endorse this, which would be engaging in a romantic or sexual relationship. And kind of where we fell down on this is, as a faculty, we decided that things that had 50% or more agreement among faculty generally do it. Now, it should be fine. If it's case by case, like 50 to 69%, before you do it, maybe discuss it with the PD. But if it was less than that 50%, we were pretty cautious, saying we should probably try to avoid that generally. Healthcare relationships, similarly, 71% said, sure, a wart is fine to remove from a resident's hand. But only 34% said it's okay to act as a primary care physician, and 40% said it's okay to deliver a resident's baby. But there were no examples that should always be avoided from our faculty survey. And then contractual relationships, they thought it was fine to pay a resident to house sit, or to request a resident to watch your pet without offering to pay. And there were no examples of things that you should typically avoid. but always avoid contacting with the resident to provide offsite medical services, such as like moonlighting or giving a loan to a resident, were things that we did that were universally wrong. And so this really helped us to transform our residency and to have kind of a common language and just a kind of a common guidance. We avoided calling it a policy. We wanted to make it just more of a guideline to guide how faculty work with residents. And I would say this really helped transform our program, and a lot of things that were going on that were probably a little bit more egregious in my mind um, went away over a year or two. And now we have a much more clear boundaries between residents and faculty.
And I would add, I was on the faculty with Randall when we did this many years ago. It was really, the process was what was really helpful, is to have an open discussion about this amongst the faculty. I would note that, of course, faculty turnover, and then so it's a constantly evolving culture. So there's always a point to then readdress this every couple years, perhaps. And it gets back to the research that we most recently did interviewing faculty, which we presented at SGFM's Salt Lake conference last May. And the audience participation really resonated with all of these topics and all these. Everyone's had an example one way or the other involving this. And both at that presentation and our recently published article in the Journal of Family Medicine, one of the main points is very few faculty could say, yes, I know of a policy at my institute, or that we've ever talked about it. So one pretty straightforward intervention, it seems to me, is to just have a session where you at least discuss this amongst the faculty, just to raise awareness. The good old Hawthorne effect, just talking about something often makes change that's in a positive direction. And as Randall pointed out, nobody loves policies because then you feel locked in. So it's better to frame it more as just a discussion, a collegial discussion and a guidance rather than a formal policy.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you, Randall and Keith, for speaking to your experience. And I think, again, that's just one example of what could be done. I think, like to Dr. Dickerson's point, just being able to have the conversation and making sure that this is something that's discussed can be helpful. So just the takeaways as we're closing up here, I think in the good times, nearly universally, faculty sought a friendly and overtly supportive relationship with residents. So when that is really the humanistic piece of all of this, is being able to connect and have those relationships is really beneficial. And really, I think some of the joy that comes from this work is being able to connect and be humans in this environment. But I think it's important to discuss and define, again, those roles early, making sure that we're transparent, especially as faculty members, of what are those roles that we hold, so that we can be aware when things do come up and be able to rely on what those roles are. And so when things are hard or difficult, it's important that we look back essentially to those core roles. In that model, we shifted the fulcrum to show that these core roles hold a little bit more weight, especially for residents. It was their perspective that provided that. These are the roles that they look for when they're looking for residency programs, that these things are present. So making sure that we're aware of what those roles are and just being mindful in situations when things do come up, asking ourselves, what is my role right now? Am I serving in an advisor role? Am I in an advising session? Am I teaching right now, or am I evaluating? To be able to provide that framework and help at least provide some guidance during these difficult situations. So that concludes our webinar today. We really appreciate you taking some of your time to join us and to hear from our perspectives and our research. Please know that you can reach out to any of us with any additional questions. And we hope that you can take something and apply it to your own setting. Thank you so much.